So did you begin to learn a few things about yourself in that 40-minute meditation? Because the whole purpose of this weekend is to demystify the mystical. That's what we want to do. We want to make it so practical and so within your reach that when you sit down to enact in a process of transformation or creation or personal change, there's nothing that's left to conjecture. You understand what you're doing and you have a certain degree of intention behind it. And so when you're not connecting, you understand that your body's in the future or your body's in the past because you've conditioned it to be that way. How many people are with me? So as you begin to become familiar with the old self and you begin to realize that you've trained it emotionally and physiologically to respond out of the moment, and that's what actually creates the electromagnetic signals that begin to cause the body to live in such strain, in such stress, in such difficulty, and that's what begins to create the genetic diseases that we inherit. So moving into the present moment is a practice. And by the way, if we were to define attention the best as we could, we would say paying attention is being present in the moment. That's all it is. Where you're present with what's being presented at hand, either internally or externally. And if your mind is wandering to a past bitter memory that's branded into the recesses of your gray matter, and you're bringing it to life over and over again, it's real, and the body responds. And if you're thinking about something 3 days from now that you have to do, and you're stressing out about that, and you're reviewing it over and over again, and you're awfulizing to the worst-case scenario, your body's going to begin to respond to think that it's in that experience long enough. And we call that normal. We call that being human. And yet, when the mystics of old talked about being in the present moment, what they were saying is that you have to do the work to begin to overcome the elements of the body in that way. And so people think that it's, So there was a question about children that's been asked a few times to me, and about childhood diseases and how do children develop certain conditions like cancer or diabetes or Tay-Sachs disease or phenylketonuria or any of those specific conditions that children have a genetic expression for. So we know the gene is turned on by the environment outside of the cell, both the environment that's in the external world and the environment outside of the cell in the internal world. And that when two individuals get together and they decide to procreate, that there's an absolute scientific fact today that the emotional condition of both of those progenitors casts the first genetic die. It's called genomic imprinting. And the emotions that those male and female progenitors are in the midst of, hours to moments to days before conception, begins to stimulate the first gene, to begin to shape and mold the organism. Now, why would that be? Well, aren't emotions the end product of experiences in the environment? So if your genome, if your sperm and your egg get the first genetic signal, wouldn't you agree then that the moment you're emotionally experiencing something, that emotion should imprint the genes so that the organism has a better chance of survival, because it's going to express the gene that's going to be able to produce the same condition that's equal to the parent? In other words, if the person's experiencing something emotionally, there's better chances of survival if that gene is expressed through that same emotion. Come on, are you with me? So in ancient cultures, in ancient African cultures, Central Africa, Northern Africa, in certain areas of Native American cultures, in certain Mideastern cultures, what happened in certain Asian cultures when a male and female got together? What's the first thing they did before the wedding? They separated them for days. Now that wasn't to increase their lust, although that's the tradition now. But it was so that they both said, okay, what is the greatest thing that I can bring? I'm gonna create and copulate in a few days here, and I want to cleanse my mind and my emotions and begin to contribute to the tribe in some way, to the culture in some way. Could be the chief, it could be the wise man, it could be the leader, it could be the medicine man. It could be the elder that's going to begin to change the course of history of this particular tribe. So I'm going to cleanse from my mind and body and bring my best intentionally. And so if two people get together in a state of lust and in a state of competition, in a state of limited emotions of anger and frustration and all of that stuff, those emotions are being activated onto the seed and the egg. And so that child is born of the flesh because it's born by those survival emotions. So that's when 1 and 1 is 2. But when people come together in a state of giving, in a state of true love and true intention, and they create, then 2 and 2 are 1. And now what is born of the Spirit comes from the Spirit by those elevated emotions. So then the organism gets the genetic imprint emotionally because it's better chances of survival in the condition that it thinks its parents are experiencing in the environment. You still with me? So the sperm and the egg get together. There's an amazing exchange of genetic information. It's called cross-linking, and the organism begins to get 23 chromosomes from the mother, 23 chromosomes from the father, and now you have this dynamic process that's taking place. And to spare you all the embryology, but there comes a moment where the maternal blood flow begins to influence the fetal development. And because the maternal blood flow is in constant communication with the child, the thoughts, the emotions, and the behaviors of the mother is influencing the child even further genetically. So if a child then is in the womb and it's faced with poverty or faced with survival or faced with violence or stress, that child's gene is going to be activated so it has a smaller forebrain and a larger hindbrain. That's because that's where all the blood supply goes when adrenaline is turned on. So the body's going to mold larger adrenal glands, weaker immune system, smaller head circumference. Why? Because now the organism, the growing fetus, has to be prepared for the same environmental conditions that the mother is embracing for better chances of survival into perpetuity. Am I making sense now? So the gene's turned on again, even further. So then there's birth. And then after there's birth, then there's a dance between nature and nurture, between the gene and between the environment. And so then we tend to inherit from our parents what they master emotionally. We have two real basic characteristics that we inherit. We inherit our physical characteristics from our parents and their emotional propensities, what they've mastered. And so if your mother was a master at suffering, hang on. Because somebody's going to be born with that particular expression genetically, one of the offspring. And if your father was great at anger and knew how to do that really naturally and easily, there's going to pass that gene on because that gene was really what he emotionally embraced. And then, isn't it unusual that we're raised by the same people that we inherit the same genetic propensities from, so we begin to imitate them in the environment? Do you know what I mean? In other words, we get the genetic expression, then we're raised by the same people that we've gotten the genetic expression from, which reinforces the gene. You still with me? So then think about this. We have a type of neurons as children called mirror neurons, and they're throughout our entire life, but they're predominantly in youth. And mirror neurons are called empathy neurons. And empathy neurons means that when you feed your kid, you go, you're doing that. And the reason you're doing that while you're feeding your kid is you're saying, imitate me. And all organisms in nature learn by imitation. That's why I always say, don't tell your kids to clean the room and have a messy room. They learn by example. They watch everything you do and they imprint that. And so when the zebra hides in the high brush and takes its offspring, the colt, and makes it stay right with it, and still, that offspring is imitating to survive in the environment. Or if the lion's teaching the cubs how to hunt, those cubs are learning by imitation. And so the behavioral patterning that takes place ensures a better chance of survival. So our children tend to learn from us because they imitate our behaviors. You still with me? But there's still an opportunity then, because the genes that we learn and we inherit, and then we begin to learn from our environment. The genes are our starting point in life. That we know now that genes are actually changeable, and they're changed primarily through the emotions of experience. And so we can turn on new genes and turn off old genes, and that can continue throughout our entire life. So children who are born with a certain genetic expression, there's something emotionally that could potentially have happened in utero, before conception, exposure to environmental toxins. There's all kinds of things that where the environment inside the body and outside the body could have influenced the gene from its typical behavior. Are you still with me? Now, just because you have a gene for Alzheimer's doesn't necessarily mean you have to have Alzheimer's. Just because you carry the gene for cancer doesn't necessarily mean you have to have cancer. That is an absolute lie. As a matter of fact, when they began to code the human genome, they figured there'd be about 140, 120,000 different gene expressions. They figured, well, there's about 100, 200 different tissues, and it takes a certain amount of genes to make the tissues, and so about 100,000 genes to make all the different proteins, and we'll throw in about 40,000 regulatory proteins. Well, when they did, because that would make total sense. But we only expressed 23,600 genes. So we're making more proteins than we have genes, and genes are what make proteins. So this concept of our genetic expression is being blown apart right now because we're not our genes. And just to regulate RNA, there's 40,000 regulatory genes just for RNA. There's more genes to regulate RNA than we express. How do you explain that to your mother? The point is, my mother never wants to talk to me about these things. The point is that our genes are quantum soup potentials. And they're a library of possibilities. And that we can signal those genes to begin to respond in new and unusual ways. And you're going to see in the next 10 years the research go off the chart because they're going to begin to figure out how to communicate with the gene through changing the environment outside the cell. But if you're working with people who are staying in the same subjective mind and body, the gene isn't going to do much. In other words, the guy who said you can't even grow new neurons in your brain was studying rodents in an unchanging environment. They weren't having any new experiences, so don't expect any new neurons to grow. You take those rodents and you put them in a changing environment where they're learning new things and they're creating and they're growing new brain cells. So we got to begin to ask the bigger questions to begin to realize that we are actually in the process of continuous change. But if our environment isn't changing, nothing outside of us is changing, can you begin to see then, if you're living in a predictable world where the environment isn't changing in any way, how could the gene change in any way? Are you with me? So then should we wait for the environment to change, or should we simulate environmental change by changing the emotional signal to the body? So now, you also understand then that as the developing child is moving through different levels of development from the ages of 0 to 6 or 8 years old, their brainwave patterns are totally suggestible to the environment because there's no analytical mind to decode information. It's just being encoded into the subconscious. And that becomes the very foundation of people's behaviors. I was on the plane a little ways back, and I was going from Seattle to Minneapolis and then to New York. And I sit down in the chair, and I whip open my laptop, and I'm like ready to go. And all of a sudden, this lady's like, and I'm like, hi, kind of typing. And she's, about 60 years old, super beautiful, really refined, with, really pretty. And so I say, hi, and all the flight attendants saying hi to her, and she was like the senior flight attendant from Northwest Airlines, So, I have a little conversation with her, and I go back to doing my thing, and then I have to close my laptop down because we're taking off, and we take off, and so I open a book, and she's kind of asking me all these questions, and where are you from, and, So I realize that this lady wants to have a conversation with me. So I open up my laptop, and I try one more time, and she starts talking again, so I finally close the laptop, And I turn off and I square off with her, and we have this great conversation. Now, she's a retired person now, and she's going to see her daughter in New York. And she couldn't have children. So 27 years ago, she decided that she wanted to adopt a child. And so she couldn't find any adoption agencies in the United States that fit the criteria, so she decided that she wanted to go international. And they located a child, a female, in South Korea. And they found this child abandoned, naked, in a subway in complete terror by her parents, abandoned by her parents, naked, freezing. So they scooped this girl up and they sent her to different orphanages and halfway houses to try to get her set up. And she's going from place to place, not knowing anybody. And the conditions are very difficult for her. So they scored this girl, and she's in this young child, and she's in this particular place, and I think she's 5 years old or 6 years old at the time, 5 years old. And so they send, the adoption agency sends a Caucasian man to a South Korean orphanage, and this guy walks in and picks this kid up and walks out with her, and this kid now is in complete terror. Complete terror. They get on the plane, 17 hours on the plane, this kid is screaming at the top of her lungs for 17 hours. To the point where she's vomiting and passing out. She doesn't want to live. She arrives in Seattle, and it takes years for this kid to begin to bond with her mother. Now, she's telling me this story in between her telling me how wonderful and how smart her daughter is and how she's gone to NYU and she's got all these degrees and going through all this stuff. And so I'm kind of sitting there and I'm listening to her, and I said, "You mind if I ask you a personal question?" She said, "Sure." I said, "How many times has your daughter tried to commit suicide?" And this lady fell apart on me. She started crying so hard. Her daughter tried to commit suicide 4 times, 27 years old, by the time she was 27 years old. Now, why would that be? Because the moment she moves into the emotion of fear or loss of control or any of those emotions from the environment, she regresses back to that child when she's 5 years old. And what did that child want to do more than anything else at 5 years old? Die. And she said she's gone to all the psychotherapy in the world and it hasn't changed anything. And I said it won't, because it's not here. It's in the subconscious. It's in the body. And so we started talking about EMDR and energy medicine, and we started talking about giving her some options, and she was so relieved because she realized that nothing had worked up to this point, because I drew pictures for her and I showed her what was going on. The point I'm making is this, as that becomes the very foundation of who we are emotionally. And when we confront issues in our life that are similar emotionally, if we haven't resolved that emotion, it's like we return back to 5 years old. How many people here know people, when they get emotional, they turn into a kid? Doesn't have to be you. It could be anybody. Well, why is that? Because the person has stopped evolving at that point in their life. So my question to you is, at what point did you stop evolving from an emotional standpoint? And what emotion have you memorized that's become part of your personality that has stopped your personal evolution, where you have stopped learning about life and you've used feelings as a barometer for life? Because that emotion that you've memorized literally anchors you to the past. You can't look into the future if you're living by that emotion, because by very definition, your emotion is keeping you looking this way, even though you say you want to go this way. So remember my example in Seattle or Vancouver of that lady whose husband left with the milkman and the 3 secretaries and went to the Bahamas and, started a new life. In the one scenario, the woman is angry her entire life, can't forgive, resentful. She lives by a long refractory period of emotions that becomes part of her personality. And you say to her 20 years later, "So why are you so angry?" They say, I am this way because of what? This event that happened then. which really means I stopped evolving, I stopped living. And actually, that emotion that I'm perceiving life by now is connected to a past experience, and I'm filtering everything out of life based on how I emotionally feel. And because those emotions are driving me, and they're what I've memorized, those emotions are actually priming the circuits in my brain to look for reasons to pick out so that I can reinforce how I feel. You still with me? We could say that that person is anchored to the past. If you talked possibility to that lady, would she ever see a future? Huh? Never. Because she's anchored to that experience of the past. The other lady, husband leaves with the 3 secretaries and the milkman. She gets on with her life. She raises her kids. She goes back to school. She gets past the emotions. Short refractory period. She's not defined by that experience. She falls in love. She gets a new life. She has a house in Europe now and a house in the United States. Her husband's great. He ravishes her. He loves her. They're connected. You say to that person 20 years later, so your husband left you, 20 years ago. That was the best thing that ever happened to me. What's the difference? One person's living in the past, and the other one has let go and moved into a future. So would you agree then that by its very definition of emotion, that emotion then filters reality based on what we believe is true about reality? And we make up beliefs and perceptions based on how we feel and how we think. Are you with me still? So then, could you say the quantum world doesn't work for me because I've been doing the meditation and nothing's happened? Or would it be more like, what emotion have I not let go of that's keeping me confined to the past? That's what my kids say. My kids say, when it's not unfolding, man, I'm holding on to something emotionally that I need to let go of. That's all they say. I got to give that up because I got to make some more energy to create with here. So then, if you're talking about the past to reaffirm who you are emotionally now, would you agree that the only reason you're talking about the past is to remember who you were or who you are emotionally to reinforce why you haven't been able to change? I think I'm starting to reach some of you. I think I'm starting to reach some of you. So then, can you live a future potential now? Can you live a future potential now? So, when you take my stallions that have a hot fence around them, because, if you don't put a hot fence around a paddock and you have stallions, you know what they're going to do, don't you? They're going to break through the fence because nature calls. They do. And or they'll jump the fence. And you see them running up the hill, like, oh, there they go. And you can't put stallions with other stallions because that's the male thing, right? Too much competition. Hint. Anyway, so men are looking at me like, what are you talking about? The women are all like going, yeah, we know. So when we first were training our stallions with the hotline, when it came time for us to walk them out of the paddock, you know what they would do, don't you? Why? Because the memory, emotionally, was stopping them from crossing through. So if your body is the animal to the mind, and you begin to make a choice about a future, there will be the same experience with your body. It will freeze and not want to step any further. Are you with me? And that frozen moment is literally energy frozen in your body, which means then, just like that horse that can run down the road and go down trails and experience, run along the river and do all those things, is missing out on all these opportunities because it thinks it's going to be stung or injured in some way. So what conclusions have you made about a future that revolves around the fear of being hurt, the fear of loss, the fear of pain, the fear of abandonment, the fear of not being loved, that stops you from going further? Because it's a visceral thing. And it's not only visceral in terms of a genetic component, it's hardwired in the brain. It's hardwired in the amygdala. And so we literally have to go against our biology. We literally have to go against our nature. We literally have to go against years of genetic memories that our progenitors and forefathers embraced the same. Now imagine a line of 100 lifetimes embracing the same fear. Is that going to be pretty encoded into the DNA? Is it going to be pretty hardwired into the brain? So you understand now that this conditioning process, this retraining process, requires a certain degree of effort. Yes? Because it's actually swimming upstream. You're going upstream to a certain degree. But you have to love yourself enough to realize you're even embarking on the process. Do you know what I mean? That if you settle for your genes, if you settle for that as the end-all of who you are, you have no control of your destiny. You're going to wake up one day and you're going to be thinking the same thoughts as your parents, behaving just like your parents, and emotionally living the same emotions as your parents. Don't give me the because if you've given up on your dreams, if you've given up on your work in progress as yourself because you're going to tell me you're not a good meditator, we all meditate all day long. What are you meditating on is the question. That's the question. So what then do you want to remind yourself to be? And more importantly, if you believe this, you really believe this, then what do you want your body to begin to feel like? What do you want to condition your body emotionally to think it's in an experience ahead of the experience? Am I making sense? In other words, can you sit there, and if I say to you, okay, I want you to move in to that state of absolute gratitude that you're a wealthy woman. And don't you let your mind get in the way, feel it in your heart, and let your body begin to think it's in the experience emotionally. And I gave you a few minutes to do that. Can you knock up that emotion in your body? I can. What's the signal you're creating in the field? The wealth is here, body. Your body's experiencing it emotionally because it's being signaled emotionally. If I said to you, what is the joy of being a liberated person from that past self that kept you enslaved to limited programs? Can you feel the joy of being liberated right now? And can you convince your body emotionally that it's in the experience in the present moment now, your future in the present moment? Can you do that? Gentlemen? Gentlemen are kind of going, well, I don't know, I haven't experienced it yet. No, that's not the point. You got to let go. You got to let go. You got to play. And if I said to you, can you become inspired about a new life? And if you had your life the way you wanted it, could you signal your body emotionally to begin to think that it's in the experience of the new life before it happened? Destiny child. You can do that? You can do that, right? Can you? So then, if you're able to do that, then, we could say then, you are ahead of your time. Yes? You're a maverick. You're a leader. You're a visionary. You're way out of time right now. And your body will genetically begin to become signaled. Genetically begin to become signaled because the emotion is signaling the gene, because the emotion is what memorizes the environment and signals the gene. You can literally turn on 23 genes in a matter of moments if you let yourself go and fall in love with the future and begin to change your emotional state so that you can communicate with your body from a physiological standpoint so it begins to think or perceive that it's in the experience in that moment. It's not that hard. So then you say, well, I don't feel like it. Then I'd say, well, then you're addicted to whatever that feeling is. But if you can let yourself go long enough to play, and you can allow your body to begin to become signaled emotionally, and the emotion is the record, literally the record of chemical responses through your sensory inputs from your environment, that blend of sensory input, of what's created from seeing and smelling and tasting and feeling and hearing, produces a state called an emotion, and that emotion then signals the genes so that you can memorize the environmental cue. And so your body begins to adapt to the new experience. But remember, I said, what if nothing new is happening in your life or in your environment, and you're living by past emotions of fear or anxiety or worry? What is the signal to the gene? It's pushing the button that's causing you to head for your genetic destiny, because I'm sure your parents lived by those same emotions. We all do. But greatness, true leaders in history, they didn't care. They didn't care if they were considered foolhardy or insane. They actually saw it as a compliment, like, yeah, I am pretty nuts. And if I move in and mix in with you, I'm going to become normal again, and God forbid, I'd rather be nuts. And then what happens? They have a personal transformation. St. Francis is now a saint. He was a nut at one time, talking to the animals, running around naked. Now he's considered a saint. So, you have a different brain than any of those great people in history? I mean, when you're around a great person and you see it, you see who they are, they're being that. They're transparent in that way. An opportunity to listen in a very intimate setting to Nelson Mandela talk. It's like the guy has 1,000 reasons to be angry. It's that 1 ounce of malice in that man's bones. Why? He overcame his adversity, and now he's an amazing individual. Now, he had every reason to be bitter. We're defined by our adversity. You're defined by your adversity. So can you begin to signal your body to change? By talking to it emotionally so that your body perceives it's in the event ahead of the actual event? Can you play with me now? So let's do it. Let's go through a little process here. I'm going to take you through it. It's not going to take too long if you're worried about time. And all we're going to do is I'm going to take you through this little process. Now, I'm going to make you breathe this time. You know why? Because I want to wake you up. I want to get oxygen to your brain. I want it to turn on. I want your forebrains to light up. I want your hindbrains to cool off. I want you to be attentive, okay? And then we'll run through a series of things. And I'm going to make you pick a potential somewhere up here or somewhere here. And I'm just going to run through a series of different ones, and I'm going to ask you to begin to signal your body emotionally so that it thinks it's in the event. What do you have to lose except turn on some new genes? That's the worst thing that could happen to you. That's it. And then I'm going to make you begin to memorize those feelings so that it's easier to reach